Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for April 24th, 2024. Today I'm going to be discussing the trip that is starting today by Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who will be traveling to China for meetings with Chinese leaders. According to the State Department, the purpose is to build on the potential from the phone call between Presidents Biden and Xi on April 2nd, and also the recent trip to China by Treasury Secretary Yellen, who was there on April 8th. Now, there's a twofold purpose to this visit. First, this idea of stabilizing the relationship between the two largest economic powers in the world and two competing, at least according to the United States, competing military powers. But secondly, it's to warn China to back off any opposition to the unipolar order and to work with the United States against Russia to end the war in Ukraine, to warn China not to do anything to aid the Russian focus or the Russian actions in Ukraine. Also, to stop the sale of weapons, components, and dual-use products to Russia. Also, to warn China not to threaten Taiwan, which China wouldn't be doing if the U.S. wasn't turning Taiwan into an issue against China. After all, the U.S. still accepts the one China policy, which means Taiwan is, according to international law, part of China. And then finally, to warn China against aggressive behavior throughout Asia. Now, Blinken doesn't seem to see the problem with the contradiction between these two approaches. Remember, this is the same person who lectures the world about we need humanitarian support for the Palestinian people. At the same time, he's delivering weapons to Israel to carry out genocide against Palestine. And at the same point, the United States is covering for Israel at the UN General Assembly and Security Council. Now, furthermore, this visit is coming right after the U.S. Senate and House voted on an $8 billion package of military support to Taiwan. Again, you're giving aid to a province of another country in violation of international law. What if China was giving money and weapons to separatists in the United States? Now, furthermore, this is part of the U.S. moves for global NATO. You think the Chinese aren't aware of this? We have the AUKUS deal, the Australia, UK, US nuclear subdeal, which is to bring Australia in to join the containment of China with the United States and other countries, especially Britain. It's also after the Kishida visit, the Prime Minister of Japan was in the United States to consolidate a Japanese role as part of the anti-China coalition. And it's coming as there are sanctions against Chinese companies, including the vote last Saturday in the U.S. House and then confirmed by the Senate to force the Chinese company to sell TikTok because it's supposedly spying on Americans. Now, this is another example of blatant hypocrisy. The Congress just voted to reauthorize the FISA court, including warrantless wiretaps, spying on Americans. So it's the U.S. that's spying on Americans, and the idea that TikTok is somehow a great threat to American data and security is merely another way of rubbing their finger in the eye of China. Now, this is what I would say is the true face of the unipolar order. On the one side, you issue your demands as part of a so-called rules-based order. On the other hand, you have military capability set to go to any country that doesn't submit to this arbitrary set of rules. The U.S. is funding wars a war in Ukraine, a genocide in Gaza. and a potential war against China, and is going around the world lecturing other countries that they have to be committed to peace. Now, in contrast to this U.S. gunboat diplomacy, we're seeing the continued moves of nations, sovereign nations, for cooperation and mutual development. Yesterday, for example, Erdogan of Turkey traveled to Iraq, where he met with the Iraqi prime minister. And ministers participated as well from Qatar and from the United Arab Emirates. And what were they talking about? They were talking about something called the Development Road Project, which is a connection via highways and rail, including to ports, as well as improved water sharing of the Tigris and Euphrates River. Peaceful cooperation for mutual benefit, as opposed to the U.S. still having troops in Iraq which are not invited there, supposedly to counter terrorism, which was largely created by the United States. Then you have Iran's President Raisi in Pakistan, talking about joint energy and transportation projects, including a gas pipeline from Iran to Pakistan, as Pakistan needs gas and other fuel. Again, cooperation, development. In Moscow, Putin met with the president of Azerbaijan, and they discussed plans for opening the international north-south transport corridor. This is, again, part of a broader economic program of cooperation and connection of the nations of Eurasia, part of a Eurasian integration. Now, why is it that the US and the British would oppose such a thing? This goes back to 19th century, early 20th century geopolitics. The fear that the empire, at that time the British Empire, today the Anglo-American dollar empire, is threatened by alliances between countries in Europe and countries of Asia. The idea of Eurasian integration is seen as a threat to the corporate cartels that run the Western Empire. Well, got news for you, Blinken. That's the way the world's going. The rest of the world is no longer interested in supporting the U.S. unipolar order. It's not that it's a multipolar world. It's a rejection of a colonial policy enforced by U.S. and NATO military to benefit the corporate cartels of the military-industrial complex, the raw material cartels, the big pharma, the financial cartels, and so on. That era is ending. And until the United States recognizes that, there's a danger that continued U.S. enforcement of that colonial policy could trigger broader wars, including a nuclear war against Russia or China. So this is what is at stake with Blinken's trip to China. What's he going to do? Try to play nice or issue threats? And what backs up the U.S. threats? We see that the U.S. is continuing to push the war in Ukraine, the proxy war against Russia, to the last Ukrainian. Is this what the Taiwanese people want? The people who live on the island of Taiwan? Do they want to be the sacrificial lambs, the battering ram used by the Western establishment against China? And that's what you have to keep in mind when you're listening to the reports in the Western media about how Blinken was tough but offering new levels of cooperation. Really, what we're seeing is a military economic hit team deployed by the United States. Now, I'll be discussing this extensively in my weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. That's going to be moved this week to Thursday instead of today. But I'll put up a link for that so you can catch us on Thursday. And by the way, you can send us your questions and comments to questions@schillerinstitute.org. So take advantage of that and engage in the dialogue between us. So thanks for joining me today. I'll see you again tomorrow.